OECD 経済協力開発機構ミズ・バーバラ・チアラ・ウバルディ様よりビデオメッセージが届いていますのでご紹介したいと思います。およそ20分間のビデオメッセージです。どうぞ皆様スクリーンの方にご注目ください。
Good morning, everybody. My name is Barbara Ubaldi, and I am here representing the OECD, where I head the work on digital government and open data. Thank you, first of all, to the organizers for having invited us to share our knowledge and experience at this summit. In particular, thank you to Professor Noboru Koshizuka, who's the chair of the 2019 Asia Open Data Partnership Summit. We had the pleasure of being with you in person last year in Korea. Unfortunately, we couldn't make it this year in person in Tokyo, and we hope to join the discussion physically next year. The objective of my presentation today is to share with you what we've seen in terms of emerging trends in the last 12 months across countries with which we work on open data. The work, as I was telling you last year, that we do on open data is based on our normative and policy framework that is built around three main areas, which is data availability, data accessibility, and efforts made by governments to foster the reuse of the data. This is a framework that has been developed a few years ago by the OECD, and it is utilized not only for our qualitative work, but also for the calculation of the Open Data Index of the OECD, the Our Data Index, which stands precisely for open, useful, and reusable data. So the interesting part of our work is that we apply the framework also to collect data that lead to the calculation of the index, and by doing so we acquire a lot of knowledge and insight on what governments are doing in terms of policies, initiatives, and in terms of efforts to use open data to create value. Over 34 countries have responded to the data collection that we did in 2018, and we are about to release the third edition of the index that will come out in a few months as part of our publication, Government at a Glance. The interesting part of this work is not only that we have come with a methodology that has become solid in helping countries measure their progresses, but this has helped us in gathering, let's say, insights and recent knowledge on what governments are concretely doing to transform their policies into value. And this knowledge is being captured in the report on open data that was published in the fall of last year, and that I will be very happy to share with you in case you have not had the opportunity to see a copy of the report. And why is the report, together with the index, considered, in our view, an important policy tool to help you advance in your open data efforts? Because it enables us to identify findings which correspond to main objectives that have been achieved in countries, but also key challenges that remain across countries, in order to identify, through peer learning, what individual countries are doing to overcome these challenges. So what are some of the key policy messages that we have started formulating based on the Index 2019 that will be released soon? First of all, we see that if we consider the three areas around which efforts worldwide have been strengthened by governments on availability, accessibility, and reuse of open data, there has been certainly a significant improvement in the results we see in the index across OECD countries. This means that countries have prioritized efforts not only to design good policies, but also to support the implementation of these policies to deliver results. This is a key strong indication about the fact that open data is growing more mature as a policy domain worldwide. Still, we see that the top ranking countries remain the same. I'd like to remind you that for the first two editions of the index, Korea ranked first, so you have a strong country in the region that has been achieving important results in the area of open data. You will see who comes first in the edition that we'll be releasing in 2019, but what is very important is to see the countries that used to rank among the top positions in the first two editions remain being top priority countries. There is a country that has improved enormously the actions in terms of open data that is also reflected in the index positioning, which is Ireland. And if we look at Ireland, there has been a key important development that happened in 2017, which was the adoption of a specific strategy for open data that helped the country to structure the decisions, the actions, and to focus much more on value creation. Second point of trend that we observed was that there has been a large majority of Eastern European countries that have improved their results in the index. This has come from stronger efforts to strengthen the implementation of the open data policies. However, what we see is that they still lag a little bit behind when it comes to the reuse of the data to promote the value creation of the data. What is important for us is not the overall ranking. I was in a recent meeting on open data in the Latin American region, and one of the participants said that at the end of the day, indices and rankings are sort of beauty contests. We do think that the value of an index is not that it is a beauty contest, but it is that it is a policy tool. And for us, it's a policy tool, the index of the OECD, because it helps also breaking down main priority actions that are needed around the three areas that we think are important to make sure that open data brings value. Again, I say availability, accessibility, and reuse of the data. So when we go a little bit more in depth and we look at the main trends that we've observed in relation to data availability, we see that the top countries that rank in the index are the countries that are more mature when it comes to open data policies and implementation of open data. For instance, they've adopted solid policy framework. For example, having a strategy is important. They have strong levels of stakeholders' engagement in the design of the policy and of the strategy within and outside of the public sector. And they have high-value data sets released in their portal as a way to prioritize the availability of data that is important and of relevance for the reusers. What is also important is to recognize that overall most countries have improved, so even those below the average of the OECD have improved enormously. The progresses that we can underline as the most important progresses are around stakeholder engagement, which is very important also when we come to the second pillar of the index, which is around accessibility. So what are the efforts that governments make to make sure that the data, once it's available, it's also accessible? This is not a matter also only of format of the data, but is a matter also, for instance, of developing visualization tools that make sure that users in the ecosystem can make something out of the data, even if it's simply taking personal decisions, so they do not require having strong technical skills. And in this case, if you look at the main trends, we see that progress in some countries has happened because important changes have happened in terms of portals. For example, in the case of Germany, the open data law has supported the development of the portal as a platform that enables higher accessibility of the data. I think we've been observing around the world, all of us, the strong efforts made by France to make sure that the portal would be from the beginning a platform for increasing the availability of the data, and important efforts have been happening around this specific tool that increases accessibility in many countries. Now, this is still not the reality across all countries. In many instances, the portal is still seen as a place where to increase the availability of the data and is not really utilized as a space where to drive a higher demand of the data, for instance, and where to make sure that the different users have higher accessibility to the data. And then I think you might remember what I said last year during my intervention, that in line with the key message given by the OECD, for us the third pillar of the index, which is around data reuse, is essential. Because if we all focus on having open data policies to increase value creation, certainly we need to recognize that data availability and accessibility are important conditions, but not sufficient per se to lead to the value creation, which requires that something is done with the data once the data has been made available and has been made highly accessible. So the efforts made by governments to increase the reuse of the data for us remain an area where we prioritize much of our work in understanding what's going on and in understanding what needs to be done more. So what we see is that this message is coming through quite strongly across OECD countries. So there have been important efforts made in the past 12 months by governments to reach out to the external stakeholders to promote the reuse. Again, I go back to the example of Korea, which in our view has been very strong in aligning the main results that the government wants to achieve through open data, being, for instance, economic value creation, with actions that have been made to make sure that the potential reusers of the data that can lead to economic value creation are targeted in a very precise way with precise actions. And this has been extremely important. Also, because that has led to stronger efforts to monitor and measure the reuse done by the ecosystem of the data to create value. I think many of us know that in some parts of the world, the open data policies have been strongly driven by previous efforts to increase access to information. This, in many cases, has meant that governments were very shy and hesitant in adopting measures that would enable to keep track of the reuse done of the data. As the open data policies mature, there's also a higher awareness of the fact that monitoring the reuse and measuring the reuse, it's not negative, to the contrary, helps to see if the data being made available for the reusers are actually really important for those who demand the data, and something is done out of it. So important efforts done, for instance, by Poland and by Japan to focus on economic impact and to monitor the delivery of the economic impact have to be strongly recognized. Also, governments have made important efforts to make available concrete examples of data reuse. Let's not forget the economies of scale and scaling up efforts are extremely important when it comes to the reuse. So it's important to identify good examples of data reuse that have led to good applications of services that have delivered value for the final consumers of the data, to be able to have other people learn from it. So the meeting you're having today is a great opportunity to share information on what's going on in the individual countries. Let's make sure that as we do so, we are as concrete as possible in sharing examples of good practices that have been happening in the countries. And showcasing examples of concrete data reuse is indeed an essential practice to make sure that our ecosystems grow stronger. So what is, in our view, the main priority that still remains a challenge, but should be prioritized and should be the main target area of action for many governments around the world if we want to make sure that open data policies and initiatives are sustainable, are continuous in the long run, and deliver results. We see that governments are more and more becoming aware of the importance of linking their efforts on open data with the broader efforts around what we call data-driven governments, meaning all the actions that are needed to make sure that open data is seen as part of the value chain that starts with making sure that once data is produced and collected, is also made available for reuse and for sharing and for access within the public sector to begin with. Oftentimes, we still see that within governments, even before we reach the stage in which we want to open up the data, there are still important problems with data availability and data accessibility and data reuse within the government. I think we are all familiar with the fact that oftentimes the culture of our governments is very bureaucratic. As being so, it's very much silo-based. It's very difficult to reuse data and share data within the administration. Therefore, prioritizing actions around data governance are seen as a main target by many governments worldwide to enable open data policies implementation, which is much more efficient and fruitful. So this is a big part of the work that the OECD will be focusing on in the months to come. If you look at the slide, and you can definitely circulate this presentation among the participants after my exposition, you see that there are some areas that, in our view, are important parts of a data governance. They have to see with leadership and vision. They have to see with capacity for coherent implementation that needs to be fostered within the administration. Therefore, it's about developing the right culture that provides incentives for the management of data in a coherent way, but also the opening up of the data, and skills that have to see with making sure that our civil servants are aware and knowledgeable about what it means and what it takes to manage the data properly and to open up the data properly. It's about revisiting regulations. I mentioned earlier how in many countries the adoption of specific open data laws, I'm thinking about Korea and I'm thinking about Germany as great examples, has improved the overall environment that has supported actions to strengthen open data policies. The governance of data also includes the data value cycle. So how do we make sure that when we think of data and value creation, we consider all the different steps that start with the production of the data from governments, which is production made out of government, public sector organizations, or out of public funds, and ends with the opening up of the data and with the reuse of the data. As I said, we can't look at the value creation if we don't look at the whole value cycle that starts with the production but ends up with the reuse of the data to produce some sort of value. We need to consider the data infrastructure. Oftentimes, still, there are many obstacles for data sharing, for instance, within administrations that are either technical problems or they are linked to interoperability that oftentimes is a semantic interoperability. Is, for instance, the fact that metadata is not consistently used across the administration. And this brings me to the last element of a data governance from an OECD perspective, which is the data architecture. So how do we make sure that not only we have the infrastructure that enables the access, use, and sharing of data within our administrations and eventually with actors outside of the administration, but how do we make sure that the architecture that includes, for instance, standards, metadata, interoperability frameworks, is in place so that the overall administration follows the same guidelines, follows the same rules, and follows the same approach when producing data and when sharing data. And in this sense, again, I want to bring up the example of Korea because Korea is making important efforts to further advance in the adoption of standards that have the goal to increase, for instance, the interoperability of data between the public sector and the ecosystem outside of the public sector. And when I talk about the ecosystem, I talk about the academia, I talk about journalists, I talk about the media in general, I talk about the civil society, I talk about the private sector, where the private sector, as we know, has a very diversified set of actors, including the big companies, but including also a whole wealth of startups, which are the more agile structures that can help governments foster the use of the data for value creation. So in this sense, for us, focusing efforts as the next month's priority agenda for governments is defined around the establishment of data governance is essential to ensure a coherent approach within governments, to ensure the sustainability. This is essential for having coherent frameworks that foster the reuse. This is essential for having integration of data policies that oftentimes are very fragmented within administrations. This is essential to ensure also the interoperability of data as such that, as I said a few minutes ago, oftentimes cannot be reused because they don't speak the same language. It is essential to move from having data policies to focusing on the implementation of these policies that oftentimes require having a strategy that identifies common goals, identifying actors that need to be involved to take actions, and has a set of indicators and measures that enable governments to see if progresses have been made in implementation of the strategy. Data governance is essential also to ensure the quality of the data, that oftentimes is not the one that the final users of the data expect. And it's end of all, but most importantly, essential to ensure the deinstitutionalization of the policies on open data that to be continuous and sustainable in the long run need to be able to count on a solid governance that brings stability and makes sure that when there are elections, for instance, and political priorities change, actions on open data can continue. As I said, reuse of the data is what brings the value, is what demonstrates that at the end of the day, your efforts to adopt policies and implement them is worth it. So the most important thing is to make sure that these efforts continue in the long run. And to be possible, we need to have a sound data governance that creates the conditions for sustainability. I thank you very much. As I said, I wish I could have joined you because most of the interesting parts of the discussion in these meetings happen in the coffee breaks, happen around the social moments in which we exchange our ideas and our experiences, and I really look forward to being with you next year. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good meeting.